Hi, this is an introduction to logic. I'm Mark Thorsby, and this course overviews the basics of categorical, propositional, and predicate logic. Welcome back. This week we'll be discussing enthymemes, and what exactly an enthymeme is and how it relates to categorical syllogisms, specifically when we want to try to determine the validity of a categorical syllogism. Okay, welcome back, guys. What are we doing here? We're talking about enthymemes. So the first question, of course, you're going to be asking here is, well, what the heck is an enthymeme? An enthymeme here actually comes from the Greek term enthymos. And enthymos literally means in thought. Thymos here is the word for human thought, right? So literally an enthymeme means something that's in thought, something that's in your thoughts. Now, I'm hoping that by giving you the etymology here, it may be helpful for you to remember what an enthymeme is. Essentially, an enthymeme is when you have a premise or a conclusion that's missing, right? You have a missing premise or a conclusion, a missing premise or a conclusion. Right, so let's write that down here. Right. And is an argument with a missing premise or conclusion. Okay, so that's what an enthymeme is effectively. Okay, let's hide that thing. Okay, it's an enthymeme is an argument with the missing premise or conclusion. Now, so get it this idea. Enthymeme is when is essentially these are types of arguments that occur very, very frequently within ordinary human language, within ordinary ways of talking, right? For instance, if you're making an argument about something, you may not necessarily state every premise or even a conclusion explicitly. You may rather implicitly or rather just imply what you're assuming would be evidence as well as or maybe just inferring what a conclusion is. Okay, so an enthymeme is sort of, these are examples that we see in ordinary language. So let me give you an example here from the textbook. That might be a good example here, right? The corporate income tax should be abolished. It encourages waste and high prices, right? So this is an enthymeme, right? It's basically an argument that can be put into a categorical syllogism, but what's missing here? So in order to deal with these problems, the first thing you have to ask, the first thing you have to determine is what is missing, right? Is it the premise or is it the conclusion, right? So take a look at this first example. The corporate income tax should be abolished. It encourages waste and high prices. How are you to figure this out? Well, the first thing you have to do is figure out the conclusion. Once you know the conclusion, you can work your way backward and determine exactly what the premises are, or by something further. So the first thing to do, so let's go back over here. So how to solve enthymemes. We'll just call this steps to solve. What are the steps to solve? The first step is actually quite simple, right? You have to determine what is missing. Oops. Is it a premise or a conclusion? Oops. Is it a premise or a conclusion? So the first thing you have to do is determine what the heck is missing. Premise or conclusion. All right, pardon me. Okay. Now, this is not so easy. So the first thing is determine what's missing, a premise or a conclusion. Always start with the conclusion, right? So ask yourself, what is the takeaway? This is I think the simplest way to talk about how to figure out what exactly is the conclusion, right? So ask yourself, what's the takeaway? What is, for instance, this person who argues this thing here, what is it they want me to walk away with, right? The corporate income tax should be abolished. It encourages waste and high prices. Well, they want me to walk away with this idea that the corporate income tax should be abolished, okay? So let me actually pull this example out and we can sort of show you how to do this maybe a little bit clearer, right? Okay, so that means that this thing right here, the income tax should be abolished. This is the conclusion, right? Now, that must mean that obviously this is a premise. right? So I have to figure out which one, is this the first, the major premise, or the minor premise? Remember, what you're going to have to do here is once you determine what's missing, then you have to rebuild the argument in standard syllogistic form, right? So one of the things to sort of figure this out, let's sort of look at it. If the corporate income tax should be abolished and it says it encourages waste and high prices, well, think what's missing. If you want, pause this video and try to answer that question. And if you do, what you'll discover is that what's missing is the idea that things that encourage waste and high prices are things that should be abolished, right? So, okay, so that means that's essentially what our enthymeme is here in terms of what's missing in the conclusion. So let's write this out in standard form instead. Let's always start with the conclusion, right? And remember, the conclusion can be demonstrated either by what falls beneath the line or what comes after these three triangular dots. We'll talk more about this actually when we get to chapter 6, right? Okay, so it should probably say something like all the corporate income tax should be abolished. It probably means all things identical to the corporate income tax are things that should be abolished, right? So let's write that down. All things that are the corporate income tax, I'll just put CIT for the corporate income tax, are things that should be abolished. I'll put just A here, okay? Now, the reason I did that is you can ask yourself here, remember here, because the next step is to figure out where exactly this premise goes. Does this premise go here, or does it go here, is the question. Well, in order to answer that question, you have to remember the difference between a major and a minor premise. Remember, a minor premise is identified as the premise of which the subject of the term that's in both of them is the term that's in the subject of the conclusion, whereas the major premise is identified by looking for the predicate of the conclusion. Again, go back and take a look at those older videos where we talk about what standard form is. So I have to look for the subject versus the predicate. Okay, so things that are I missed the word identical here. Things that are identical with the corporate income tax, right? So let's just call this variable C, right? Are things that should be abolished. We'll just call this A for abolished, okay? So really I have, and here you may have to write multiple versions just to make it easier on yourself, right? All C are A, okay? That's pretty simple, okay? So now let's put this next premise in things, it says encourages waste and high prices, right? Let's go back. The corporate income tax should be abolished. It encourages waste and high prices. So this should really say something like, because what is the it referring to? The it here is referring to corporate income tax, right? So ask yourself, corporate income tax, the C here was the subject, which means that this must be the minor premise, okay? So let's write it in there. It's going to look like something like all things identical to the corporate income tax are things that, we'll put E, encourage waste and high prices, okay? Now, what the missing premise was obviously the minor premise. So, and we won't use this one anymore. What's the minor premise? This is the one that's missing. Well, here you can construct it. You know that the predicate term is A, so A is here. And what's your middle term? Well, your middle term is this E. So it really should say something like, all things that encourage waste and high prices are things that should be abolished. So I would argue to be all E are C, right? So here we have, oops, I made a mistake here. I meant all E are A. I hope you caught that. I hope you're watching, right? So all E are A, all things that encourage waste and high prices are things that should be abolished. All things identical to the corporate income tax are things that encourage waste and high prices. Therefore, all things that are identical to corporate income tax are things that should be abolished, okay? This is the formal structure of the argument. We've gone from having a missing premise to ultimately translating it into its fully formalistic manner, right? So we have to first determine what's missing. Once we determine what's missing, we introduce the new statement. So let's go back here and finish our steps. right? 2. Actually, let me go down here. Reintroduce the missing statement. And then the third step is then test for validity, right? So this is essentially how we're going to address this. When you get an enthymeme, you have to figure out what's missing. And I sort of just talked a lot about that, gave an example. And then you need to reintroduce the missing statement, which we already did. And then you got to test for validity. So let's go back here and test for validity, right? Here we can test in a number of different ways, right? The first major way we can test is drawing actually a Venn diagram. So let's do that so that way we can sort of get used to it, right? So this is going to be C. This is going to be A. And then we'll go this. So I apologize for the quality of my circles. And this is the middle term here, which if you remember, the middle term here is the E, right? So remember, I hope you recall, when you do Venn diagrams, the first thing you should do here is you should determine, determine which premise to first diagram first, never diagram the conclusion. We have 2 universal premises, so we'll diagram. It doesn't matter which one we start. Let's start with this first one. All E are A. All of the E's are A, so that means this gets filled in. Okay, all of the E's are A's. And then the second, so that's diagrammed. The next diagram is all of the C's are E's. If all of the C's are E's, then it goes like this. Okay, so now let's look at what the conclusion says. All of the C's are A's. All of the C's are A's. That's right, because look, that's the only C we have left, and it's within the larger A circle. So this argument is actually valid. Okay, now you can also test for validity here by either looking it up in the table, the Aristotelian table, or just applying those 5 rules that we looked at in terms of distribution and negation. And we could do that, right? Remember, the middle term has to be distributed at least once, right? The middle term gets distributed here, so that passes that first rule. The second rule is that anything distributed in the conclusion has to be distributed in the premises and vice versa. So or not vice versa, right? So all C are A. What gets distributed here is the C is what gets distributed. So is it distributed here? It is distributed here, so it passes those rules. There's no negative, so it passes all those rules, and they're all universal, so it passes all those rules. So this is a valid argument, right? That's an example of how you approach enthymemes. Now, I do want to talk a little bit. No, we don't need to save that. I do want to talk about a little bit of something here that's important in logic. And that's what we call the principle of charity. The principle of charity. What exactly is the principle of charity? I'm going to make this big for you. Okay. The principle of charity is actually pretty important. The principle of charity basically says this, is that when you diagram, and when you take an ordinary language argument, and especially one like an enthymeme, and you translate it, what you should always do is try to be charitable in your translation. That is, there is a little bit of a wiggle room here in terms of perhaps, depending on how you understand and interpret an ordinary language argument, where you're going to put, what you're going to put as the major term and minor term. And the exact organization of the argument can vary based upon interpretation. Now that raises issues, because if you already know what the valid argument form is, and what an invalid argument form is, you could potentially try to interpret an argument you don't like in an invalid manner, right? And which wouldn't really be fair, right? So it's really this idea that justice demands that we try to evaluate arguments in the best possible light, right? So what is the principle of charity? The principle of charity dictates that when we interpret arguments in ordinary language, we give the best possible translation and interpretation, right? And by doing that, we're basically saying that we're always going to try to see and determine if we can assess that an argument is valid versus invalid. So, and the principle of charity here really has to do with the question of how we assess validity But it is a really core idea in philosophy, right? That when someone's trying to make an argument, if you're going to actually think about their argument, you need to think about it honestly, rather than trying to always trying to force their argument into being invalid. Or put it into an invalid form. So the principle of charity is pretty important here. You'll see I'll mention that as the course goes on, but I thought it's worth mentioning right here. Okay, so that's pretty much what enthymemes are. Let's do a couple examples here from the homework, just to give you a sense. You can see it's a fairly short chapter, right? So you can see here, if you're using the textbook, here's what the homework says. In the following enthymemes, determine whether the missing statement is a premise or a conclusion, then supply the missing statement, attempting whenever possible to convert the enthymeme into a valid argument. You can see here, that's the principle of charity. You're trying to attempt to convert it into a valid argument rather than an invalid argument. Now, the missing statement need not be expressed as a standard form categorical proposition, okay? So in these first problems, they're saying that you don't necessarily have to rewrite it into full standard form, because that's what I did in my example here. So let's just take this one and sort of think it through without writing anything down. Some police chiefs undermine the even-handed enforcement of the law because anyone who fixes parking tickets does that. Okay, so what's missing here? Well, first off, what's the conclusion? Always start there. The conclusion really is that some police chiefs undermine the even-handed enforcement of the law, right? That seems to be the conclusion. This "because" here is an indicator term for a premise. So that means that this thing must be a premise, and it says anyone who fixes parking tickets does that. Does that means they undermine the even-handed enforcement of the law, right? So what does this argument look like? Well, again, we have a particular here, and if our goal is to figure out a valid argument, that means that we have to have, instead of saying universals, this is a universal, anyone, we have to have a particular premise. So it's going to be something like this. All persons who fix parking tickets are persons who undermine the even-handed enforcement of the law. Some police chiefs are persons who fix parking tickets. Therefore, some police chiefs are persons who undermine the even-handed enforcement of the law. Blah. Okay, and that's essentially, so first thing I always do when I start this is sort of try to work it out in my mind. Like, okay, I understand. And then I'll always try to then, once you've sort of worked it out, then write it down symbolically. They're not really requiring you to do that here, but you can see here, if you go down here in the second section, they're going to want you to put it into standard form syllogism. So I think it's generally a good idea to just always put it into standard form syllogism, because it's good practice, and that's what you have to do on the exam.